Along with Jake Tapper as we await an extraordinary moment of mourning and unity in a divided Washington. Right now, President Bush's flag-draped casket is inside the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. It will be carried down the Capitol steps soon, the first of many solemn rituals on this day. We'll watch as the hearse and motorcade travel down Pennsylvania Avenue, past the White House, where Bush 41 served as vice president and then president, and on to Washington's National Cathedral. There, the Bush family will join with U.S. and world leaders, friends, and bitter rivals to celebrate George Herbert Walker Bush's 94 years of life and his legacy. Jake, this service will be exactly as President Bush would have wanted.
And that's right. He planned it for years. The president, who said that famously he wanted a kinder, gentler nation, made sure, in fact, that the current commander-in-chief would be at his funeral despite their considerable differences in both policy and personality. It's hard to overstate what a remarkable gathering we're going to see inside the National Cathedral. President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump will join all four living W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. We'll also see Barack and Michelle Obama, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. It will be the first time all of them have been together since January 2017, the Trump inauguration. And for political junkies and the public, the body language should be fascinating, although it's anticipated that partisan politics and differences will be set aside for this moment, especially for the moment when Bush 43, George W. Bush, eulogizes his father. And we expect this to be very emotional and personal for him. And he's not going to be talking about necessarily moments of import beyond George H.W. Bush, the family man.
Yeah, this is understandably so, very emotional. This is a son speaking about his dad. It will be powerful. Let's get some more on what we can expect in the immediate hours ahead. Chris Cuomo is over at the National Cathedral for us. He's with Jamie Gangel and Dana Bash. They have new details on what we will see and hear at this historic funeral. Chris?
You know, and this is historic on a lot of levels. One that's not as important, but people should know. With all these presidents and dignitaries here, the security is unusual here, unusual in its depth, its breadth, its timing. So that's going to be part of it today. We may see some delays as a result this morning, but it's certainly worthwhile given the import of everybody they need to keep safe here. And the memorializing of this president, which will take place in phases, is going to start here, though, with this. You're going to hear from three different people today. John Meacham, former Senator Alan K. Simpson, and, of course, the president's son and President 43 himself, George Bush. What are they going to say? Jamie Gangel has new information for us about that. No easy task to eulogize a father.
Especially for his son. And remember, his favorite moment was when he spoke after 9/11 right in this cathedral, and his father leaned over and touched his hand. I've been told that President George W. Bush's speech will be very emotional. It will not be about his father, the statesman. It will be about his father. I know people who've read the speech, and they could not get through it without crying. So I think that's going to be a very moving moment. Then we're going to hear from his biographer, John Meacham, who will talk about the man, his character, from former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who will talk about the statesman, the global leader. And finally, get ready, hold on, Senator Alan Simpson, former senator from Wyoming, who is one of his dearest friends, who we all know is very funny. We may have some blue material. They love to laugh, those two men. They love to joke. So I think he will go where no man has gone before in the cathedral.
That's part of the trick for the president. For President 43 is, how do you deal with the pain of loss of the man who made you? When you're lucky enough to have a father like President George Bush had in his own father, not just sharing names, but sense of service and a formation of your core character.
Correct.
To balance that pain of loss, you know, the expression, a boy doesn't become a man until he loses his father. It doesn't matter what age you are. To balance that with letting people into that sense of humor, you know, the mirth around it, the fun. It's going to be hard because he's going to be trying to hold it together. I really don't believe age or stage of life matters in a moment like this. So it will be a really difficult thing, and I think that's part of our processing, to see one president struggling with their emotions.
No question. There's also going to be one other very emotional moment. President Bush loved music. He went to Hamilton this summer. He loved musicals. His favorite, Ronan Tynan, is going to be singing one of the tenors, his favorite song, The Last Full Measure of Devotion. And I just want, for those who don't know, he asked Ronan Tynan to come to see him his last day, Friday, and sing Silent Night to him right before he passed away.
Wow. Wow. And the other dynamic that is going to be impossible to keep our eyes off is the Trump dynamic. The fact that he's going to be in this cathedral with these former presidents, watching and listening to somebody be eulogized and memorialized and celebrated, who President Trump, let's be honest, has spent the past 2-3 years attacking pretty much everything that George H.W. Bush held dear when it comes to the UN or international organizations, the CIA, which has George H.W. Bush's name on the building.
Points of Light.
Points of Light, not only his slogan, but his charity and his children. You know, his children, George W. Bush, and of course, Jeb Bush, who was his rival. And yet, what you have seen over the past 2-3 days, and what we will see in here, is all of his offspring, all of the people who learned from him, trying to channel him, trying to rise above it, trying to be better than that, and trying to, appeal to the greater good, appeal to the genteel side of the politics that is gone. And that contrast is going to be really, really phenomenal. And watching the way the Bushes are going to try to do that, despite what you know is going on inside.
Right.
What would 41 do?
Right.
Is the mission this family has been given, and
Right.
how they're going to behave with
And
President
look,
Trump.
such a party loyalist that George Herbert Walker Bush was. He said everything he needed to say about this dynamic when he said he was voting for Hillary Clinton. That part of it was taken up. And, I had a family member last night ask me to promise that I would try to make this day, in terms of reporting in a matter of perspective, about remembering how things are done right. Don't dwell on when it's done wrong.
But that's the whole point of
itself.
having, exactly, that's the whole point of 41 and his children having President Trump here, having Melania here, having that moment of the way it is supposed to be. A sitting president with former presidents, honoring and memorializing a late president.
Respect for the office.
Exactly.
George Herbert Walker Bush never went into the Oval Office without putting on a jacket. That tells you.
That's it. The man is the metaphor. So we see people are arriving now. They're already a lot of people inside the cathedral here. Let's bring it back to Anderson there. Anderson will be watching here and letting you know who we see as they file in. But for now, to you.
Chris, thanks very much. We just saw Bob Kraft from the New England Patriots, the owner, entering the cathedral. We're seeing people getting off buses. John King, this is really the first state funeral since 2006. It is very rare to see an assemblage like this in this nation's capital.
12 years since we've said farewell to an American president in the same cathedral, of course. And to your point about you watching the former Democratic House Leader Tony Coelho just walking into the building, we have had, the question is how long will it last, but we have had, and for this day, we will have a remarkable, again, show of bipartisanship, respect for tradition, respect for history, and respect for this president to his family, and I believe we have smarter people than I at the table, Doug Brinkley included, and history, I think, is growing to appreciate even more. The family thinks he's underappreciated. If you think back to those days, we live in an age now where every morning there are 10 or 12 tweets and they disrupt this town. That's our definition of disruption today. If you think about the days George H.W. Bush was president, and I think that's one of the things you see. I visited the Capitol yesterday briefly, people talking about it and remembering those days. Yes, he was only a one-term president, but at an incredibly consequential time. And to see this, see the tributes, it's interesting. And in the program Jamie just went through, George H.W. Bush was a soft-spoken person, but he was funny. He's very funny. Alan Simpson it would just be great. It would be a great celebration. And like everyone, I just, having covered the George W. Bush White House, and I know him much better than his father, I'm riveted by that moment just because of the way they speak of their dad, not the president, but the way they speak of their dad and the family. And he will not be able to keep it together.
You've seen two former CIA chiefs who were in attendance.
And Anderson, this is also a convening of the President's Club. And it's a club that's really strange because nobody asked the other person to join. They all kind of find themselves together in this club. And
There's Sam Donaldson.
Yep. And there is one, member that has been distant from the rest of the club, and that is, of course, Donald Trump. And but in doing what George H.W. Bush did, which is inviting him in to this service, he has done in death what he did in life, which is to be a gracious human being. And the two men could not be more different. One was a disruptor, one was a conciliator. And it'll be interesting to see how Donald Trump reacts with the members of the President's Club around him, most of whom he has not had conversations with at all.
But
since
it
he's
also,
become president.
it says, David, a lot about George H.W. Bush that he would want Donald Trump at his service. Donald Trump is probably antithetical to everything George H.W. Bush lived by and believed in terms of service, dedicating your life to the service of others, which is what this George H.W. Bush did from the time, he was in Yale and he joined into World War II. He didn't have to do that. His dad didn't want him to do it, yet he went ahead and did it and was a hero.
Right, and in President Bush 41, the respect for the office of the presidency that he always knew and felt was bigger than himself, something that this president very often seems not to believe. And as I look at all of this, I think about dynasty and disruption. The Bush political dynasty is what we're seeing unfurled before us, because it's not only all those people who worked in the government and the administration of President George H.W. Bush, but also his son. He had a big influence on the Bush 43 administration as well. And yet George H.W. Bush, who cared about the presidency, who really cared about the niceties of politics and public service, also was subject to the kind of disruption that was kind of an early foreshadowing of what we've seen. Ross Perot, of course, Patrick Buchanan running against him in the primary in 1992, and of course that young upstart from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who represented a new Democrat and a new generation of leadership.
And Mary Kate, I mean, you were a speechwriter for the president from 1989 to 1992. It is kind of fascinating watching the assemblage of all the people who have come, all the people who have stood in line to pay their respects. It does sort of harken back to a very different Washington, to a very different time in this country's history, though it was not so long ago. Yeah. It seems like one is reminded just of sort of, obviously politics has always been rough and tumble, and it certainly was with George H.W. Bush, but in retrospect, it seems much more, I don't know if the word polite, but even though it was rough then, by today's comparison, it seems hardly so.
I speak to young people all the time about him, and if you're 25 years old or younger, you were born after he left office. And I have children that age, and most of them knew him as W's dad, I think, and really don't know much about him. And I think young people can watch today and learn a tremendous amount, even though it wasn't that long ago. As you're saying, it seems like a different era to us, but to them, we could all learn a lot. There's a great line from his inaugural address where the president said, "I take as my guide the hope of a saint," which is St. Augustine, even though he doesn't say it. In crucial things, unity. In important things, diversity. In all things, generosity. And I think that could be a theme for today, that we'll see the unity that he is inspiring in the nation right now, the diversity of people from all walks of life coming to celebrate him, and the generosity of his own personal spirit.
There's Rudy Giuliani, obviously, as he heads into the cathedral. And obviously, President Trump will be arriving shortly as well for the service. We're going to take a short break. We're waiting for the historic reunion of all the living presidents, including President Trump, sitting next to the Obamas and Clintons. And among the VIPs attending today's state funeral, President Bush's medic, who saved his life.
She is with three special guests. They are individuals who were close advisors to former President George H.W. Bush, who we are mourning today, including one advisor who was with him to the very end. Jamie.
The three men with me are personal aides who I think spent more time with him except for Barbara Bush. And did you ever get in trouble with him, the three of you? Did you ever get the look over the glasses?
If we did, we're not saying it.
Got it.
No comment.
With her.
With her, there was never a doubt. You knew.
Evan, let me start with you. Evan Sisley, you were his most recent personal aide. And one of the reasons you were picked was because you had a background as a paramedic. And you were the person who, after Barbara Bush died, you're responsible for Sully. You decided the president.
Yeah.
Talk to me about how important Sully was in those final days.
Well, so we ended up taking a look at a couple studies that showed that elderly patients do really well. They have a sense of purpose with a dog in their life, and that was a big drive for us. I also think, honestly, the dog was probably just as good for the family as it was for him. Came with 2 pages full of tasks he was able to perform. But more than anything, I think it brought everybody together with something joyous in the room.
The joke was he could do everything but make the martini.
I couldn't get that right. I tried.
On a more serious note, I know you would be too modest to say this, but you really were responsible for all the medical care day in and day out around him. You helped save his life several times. You were there the last day with him. Talk to me about what that was like.
Well, so as a medical provider, I wouldn't want to go into too much specifics, especially with medical care, but what I would say is that he was surrounded by the people who loved him the most in life, his family. Secretary and Mrs. Baker were there. This was a guy who didn't have any quit. He fought his entire life, and to see him, I think he became comfortable in the end. There's a story that Secretary Baker was saying that he said, "Bake, where are we going?" on the morning that he died, and Secretary Baker responded, "We're going to heaven." He said, "Well, that's where I want to go." So he was comfortable. He knew he was going surrounded by the best people, and we would all be so lucky to be able to have that as our way to go out.
Tommy.
Yes.
Going back in time, you spent a lot of time with President Bush traveling all over the world during what I would call the Bill Clinton buddy years.
Yeah.
Was the friendship as real as it seemed to be?
Absolutely. So they didn't have much relationship, professional relationship before 2004, but after the horrible events of the tsunami in 2005, President Bush asked both the presidents to come together and help raise awareness and raise capital. And they sadly had to do it later in the year for Hurricane Katrina. So it's Katrina and the tsunami. And they raised hundreds of millions of dollars to do it. But the bringing these two guys together was a message both in the U.S. and throughout the globe. We had some heads of state in Southeast Asia say to us, "What you two are doing, we couldn't have done in our own country," so it's really impressive. But one thing they make you do is they make you go out and actually see the destruction so you can come back and report on it and help raise the awareness. And when they got on the plane, there was it was essentially Air Force Two that they were using, and there's one bedroom. And
one bedroom, two former presidents.
Two former presidents. So President Bush, of course, gets on and says, "President Clinton, I want you to have this." And President Clinton, with great deference, says, "I'm 20 years your junior. You're going to stay in there." But President Bush goes into his room and he brings out some of the luggage he had, which was a roll-up mattress, and he went out and put it in the hallway. Oh. Put the pillows and blankets on there for him, and I think that was the start of this relationship. And every year
President Bush once said to me, he talks a lot, and President Clinton said, "I think he thinks I talk too much." They were funny together.
They constantly teased each other, but it was respectful. In many ways, I think President Clinton viewed it as President Bush as somewhat as a fatherly figure, and he would reach out to him, personal things, but he would come up to Maine every summer, and he would spend the night, and they'd go golfing or they'd go for a boat ride, and there was nothing on the agenda. It was, how's your family? How's life? Here we are, we're friends. And that's how it was until this last summer, and it's always been. So
President Clinton never missed an opportunity to say, "I love George Bush," and he really did.
Yeah,
he really did.
It was for real.
Giancarlo, go back in time for me a little bit. more and talk to me a little bit about the staff, the Secret Service. You guys, you really did love him. I mean, the outpouring of emotion and loyalty has been quite something.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had the opportunity to speak about President Bush over the last couple of days, and I always tell the story that people would say to me how fortunate I was to get to work for a former president, and they were right. But where I was really fortunate was getting to work for one of the best human beings I know I'll ever meet on this earth. Someone who did the right thing 10 out of 10 times, who was humble and kind, and brought everyone up that was around them, was just a joyful person. And that transcended the attitude, the culture of our office. Loyalty is a two-way street, and George Bush got loyalty from the people that worked for him because he gave it and he showed it every day, whether it was the staff, whether it was the Secret Service, whomever he came in contact in life, he demonstrated that and was a living example of it.
I think you told me on the phone Secret Service agents have been calling former Secret Service agents who wanted to pay their own way just to come and stand to wave.
Literally, all of us have received messages where they said, "How can I go? They don't live in D.C. or Houston, and
they just want to be there to pay their respect."
There was one of the agents wrote a piece that I read online that was beautiful, and it basically articulated this is why the Secret Service loves President Bush and the Bush family, and it gets into some of the detail that I mentioned about the respect that he showed to them, whether it was rearranging family schedules so agents didn't have to be apart from their families over
on
holidays,
Christmas and New Year's.
Right. Or the most famous story, and Tommy, you can speak to this, about the child of a Secret Service agent who was battling cancer.
And he shaved his head.
Two-year-old boy has leukemia, and the detail shaves their head. And as soon as he sees it, he says, "Get him in here. I'm doing this." I'm just emotional.
2 words, very quick. Best advice he ever gave you, Giancarlo?
To live by example.
Live by example. Tommy?
Marry my wife.
That's good. Evan?
Can't sum it up in 2 words, but when I told him I was looking at med school, he said it'll be good training and it'll be a good resume builder. I didn't understand what he meant, but what he was saying at the time was keep on pushing. Never settle at where you're at in life. Always seek going higher. This is a guy who became president in his 70s.
No secret why we all love him. Yeah. He's just the greatest man. The greatest man.
You can't work for that man and not want to just become a better version of yourself.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the pinnacle of what everyone wants to be, and he was it. It's so
incredible.
True. So we were all lucky.
Thank you all for being
Jamie.
here today. Thank you. Jake?
Thanks, Jamie.
You know, Jake, we're watching the guests, the invited guests arrive. So many friends, family members. We're continuing to watch as other mourners they gather at the National Cathedral here.
It just seems like such a stark contrast to the way things are now.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be. You know, I think that's what I'm hoping young people take from this, is that politics today don't have to stay the way they are. And it wasn't that long ago that we saw people reaching across the aisle and getting landmark legislation through the Congress together. And I think as you see today, it'll unfold just how President Bush did that. And it wasn't so much political gamesmanship or maneuvering. It was treating people with decency and respect, no matter who they were in life. And from the Queen of England to the guy mowing the lawn. And that, to me, is a key for young people to see that was what made him so successful.
There was Colin Powell, obviously. You tell a story about a guy named Don Rhodes, who I had never heard about, but it's sort of fascinating, and it's kind of a window into the kind of person that George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush were.
So Don Rhodes was a 20-something campaign volunteer in the 60s on the Senate campaign in Texas. He was working the overnight shift at a convenience store and volunteering during the day for the Bush campaign. And he was a bit of a lost soul. He was an orphan, and he was half deaf. And the president, or then Mr. and Mrs. Bush at the time, took him in and employed him for the rest of his life. And Marvin said he was like a brother to me as they grew up. He was older than George W., but younger than the Bushes. Stayed with them and worked with them for the rest of his life as sort of their personal assistant. And Don Rhodes, there's all these funny stories about him, and he exemplifies the President and Mrs. Bush's faith and how they lived their faith. He made a plaque for President Bush that stayed on his desk for years that said, preach the gospel at all times, use words when necessary. And that, to me, embodies the way the Bushes treated Don Rhodes. It was a long-standing joke that if someone came up to you and said, "Oh, I'm very good friends with the Bushes," you'd say, "Oh, well, then you must know Don Rhodes." And if they said, "Who's Don Rhodes?" you'd say, you know. So Don Rhodes is...
And his ashes are actually...
Yeah, he after he died about 5-10 years ago, the president and Mrs. Bush decided to spread his ashes on their gravesite with them, not at Don's request, at theirs. And so tomorrow, when we see President Bush buried, everybody else has been saying, well, he'll be joining Robin and Mrs. Bush, but very few people know he'll be joining Don Rhodes as well.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
We're getting closer to the big moments of the day. President Trump.
Wife, just some of the thousands that will be coming here today. We're told that there are approximately 3,000 attendees will be at the funeral, the state funeral of President George Herbert Walker Bush. This is such an important day for the family. Of course, it is a funeral. It's a sad occasion, but such a full life of 94 years, such a big and proud clan. His family's been coming in waves. You'll be seeing them on your screen, that there's so much to remember fondly. And in a moment, for this nation, this is a reminder of a man of profound decency and a man who led this country that way. And you're going to hear that in different layers of eulogies today, and you're going to hear that from family members in interviews, that's what they want this day to be about. The right way to lead, as exemplified by their grampy and their father and their great-grandfather as well. So I'm with Jamie Gangel and Dana Bash, and of course, the moment of the memorial of this particular funeral service will be when, and you see Karl Rove there on your screen coming in. There are many big shots that are going to be coming in, and you'll see them on the screen. We'll point them out when necessary. But a father eulogizing a son, I know it's historic.
A son eulogizing a father.
A son eulogizing a father. Look, we know it's historic on many levels. You know, John Adams and John Quincy Adams were father and son, but not having the son eulogize the father, as will happen today. But history aside, the emotion of a moment like that, the task of speaking about the man who has meant the most to you in your life as a mentor and as a man maker, the core of your person, and now president to president in front of this type of crowd. I'm not talking about as a political challenge. I'm saying as a personal challenge to balance all these things, Jamie. Not easy, because this was real. There is nothing fake about the love between father and son here.
No question. And I'll tell you something that probably won't surprise you. He didn't want to give the eulogy.
Sure.
He felt he would be too emotional, but the family came to him and they said, you have to do it. And one of the reasons it'll be very hard is in the days right after 9/11, there was a service here, and Bush 43 spoke at it, and he said it was his favorite moment of his presidency between father and son. You'll remember when he came down afterwards,